countdown to the big ticket event. Complete transformation for Delhi.
Unprecedented capital security.
Delhi becomes the world's diplomatic hub.
A 4-day lockdown and watertight security.
Quick response teams in place. World embraces India's youth.
To an ultimate India experience.
Vishwamitra leads global agenda.
A coverage like no other.
Only on CNN News 18.
Welcome. Thank you so much for staying with CNN News 18. You're watching Viewpoint with me, Prihato. Now, this evening on the broadcast, we talk about India's moment of the sun as the G20 president, as leaders from the most powerful nations in the world are flocking to New Delhi for the G20 Heads of State and Government Summit. The culmination of India's year-long presidency of the G20, the summit itself, will be concluded with the adoption of a G20 leaders' declaration, which will state the participating leaders' commitment towards the priorities discussed and agreed upon during the respective ministerial and working group meetings. According to the government sources, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be holding over 15 bilaterals during the G20 summit. And as Russia and Ukraine find themselves in the throes of conflict, all eyes will be on whether there is a consensus on a joint declaration. After all, the G7 grouping of the world's largest economies want a condemnatory language on Russia's actions and words. Though Moscow and Beijing will allow none of that, and with their presidents staying away from the summit, some of the sheen of G20 has been taken away, with many of the headlines being governed by only that aspect. The biggest complication for India is presented by China's telling absence, laying bare India's strained ties with the country over the ongoing border standoff. Although, by taking the G20 meetings and priority to every part of the country, India, in fact, has reimagined the presidency in a way no host has done so far. With 200 plus meetings across more than 50 locations, that has created a new template in size and scale. In addition to articulating the concerns of the global south, India has also advocated expansion of the G20 by including the African Union, which represents the 54 countries of the continent. Remember, the G20 now has only one African country, South Africa, as a member. Now, before I open this up to my guests who join me this evening, let me go across to my colleague Siddhant, who's joining us live from the Bharat Mandapam. He, of course, has been getting us all that is happening at the Bharat Mandapam, the venue for the G20 Summit. It is going to be full of action starting tomorrow and day after, but today as well, there was a flurry of press conferences that were organized over there that was headed by the chief coordinator of the G20, also the G20 Sherpa and the foreign secretary. In fact, before I go to Siddhant, let me also take you through the visuals that you see on your screens. The South Korean president is currently He has in fact landed in the national capital. He's been greeted by Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, the MOS, the Minister of State, the Union Minister. He in fact is also going to be meeting with the Prime Minister. There are a series of bilaterals, remember, like I said at the start of the broadcast, that are lined up for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This one also becomes an all-important press conference, a bilateral that will happen possibly on the last day of the summit, that is on the 10th of September. So he there, along with his wife, has landed in the national capital. And let's go back to my colleague Siddhant and also Akanksha, who's joining us live from the Bharat Mandapam, where all the action currently is. Siddhant, I'll begin with you. We were talking about the earlier press conference with the chief coordinator, the Sherpa, and also the foreign secretary were taking questions. The common question that was part of that press conference is, of course, whether there is going to be a consensus on a joint declaration. And that sort of dominates the headlines. And right now, we do not have an obvious answer to that. The answer that came out was just wait for that series and the summit to get over. Before that, we cannot really say anything about a joint declaration. If we talk about what had happened during the Delhi declaration, where there was no consensus, and going by that, where this narrative really is going, what are you expecting when it comes to that crucial question? Siddhant?
Well, yes, that's right. So perhaps that was in the mind of every journalist sitting in that room during the press conference. And that was the most pertinent question to be asked to the Indian side, that what about the consensus, where have we reached on the part of consensus? Because there were objections raised by Russia and China, both in finance track and in Sherpa track. So when those questions were asked to Chief Coordinator Shringla and Sherpa Amitabh Kant, they said that Delhi Declaration is going to be the voice of Global South. So that is perhaps the statement of the day made by Amitabh Kant. Now there is no consensus, likely to be no consensus, because speaking to our sources, speaking to people associated with G20, there has been rephrasing of para 3 and 4. The similar issues are there with the finance track, but it's getting difficult to build consensus. One. Also, a very important point, and what is visible to each one of us. Maybe Indian side is saying that they are hopeful. It is up to the leaders to forge the consensus. But it looks like that the European countries, UK, US, the other EU and the European countries are adamant when it comes to Ukraine. And perhaps you look at Rishi Sunak right before arriving in New Delhi. There is an announcement coming from his office that London is going to launch a summit for Ukrainian grain. London is going to pledge amount to make sure that Ukrainian grain reach other countries, since Russia has opted out of black grain commitments. So, that is the level of commitment that Europe, London, England, America, and all these countries are showing for Ukraine. Okay. So if this is a situation before arriving to Delhi, you expect what's going to happen tomorrow when the first session is going to sit, or perhaps maybe the second session in the afternoon. How can we expect everyone to come on to build consensus? So it's going to be a very tough. India is walking a tightrope, and perhaps tomorrow also it's going to be very tough or perhaps difficult to build consensus.
All right, so thank you so much for that. And before I go to you, Akanksha, let's also tell our viewers that the Egyptian President, Mr. Al-Sisi, is also arrived in the national capital. We are also playing those visuals live for our viewers as the dignitaries continue to come in, the world leaders continue to come in. They've been greeted by the union ministers back home here in the national capital, and those arrivals become really crucial ahead of the G20 Summit that starts tomorrow. Akanksha, taking from where Siddhant really left, if we talk about world leaders, specifically Brazil and South Africa becomes a really, really crucial case. Considering we are talking about addition of the African Union into G20, it is possibly going to be G21 by the end of the summit. We still do not know about that. But when it is about that joint declaration, how much of that crucial part is South Africa going to be playing in it?
Griha, as far as welcoming the African Union to the G20 is concerned, this is one key marker to India's success of G20 presidency that has already been spoken about. Because remember, if we talk about Jake Sullivan, what he said just a day ago, he made it amply clear that India's G20 presidency has brought the African Union. It's going to be the other big bloc to the G20, because remember, the only other big bloc so far which was part of the G20 was the EU, and now with African Union coming in, a lot of it is going to change. When we look at trade, when we look at major players, we've known that China and Russia have played an important role when it comes to the continent, but now you will have other major big players, including India and the United States as well. And when you talk about African Union, I think even when we talk about Ukrainization, the term that was used by the Russian ambassador to India was that a lot of other agendas are being hijacked by the issue of Ukrainization. One important key success or a marker to India's success, because it's fairly nascent to talk about success, because you remember the summit is still ahead. The important aspect of the G20 summit is going to be how, as far as African Union is concerned, or AU being welcomed is concerned, that is almost finalized. Because remember, one concern that India had was that will the West be as welcoming? And even when CNN News 18 held its town hall, I remember our managing editor Zaka Jacob posed this question to one of the ambassadors, and especially the EU ambassador, and they were asked if they are going to be equally welcoming to the idea of African Union joining in, and they've given a very, very solid nod. And it's not just the EU but also the United States, which has in fact welcomed the idea of having African Union join in. So let's make it very clear, we cannot have the issue of Ukraine sort of overshadow other important burgeoning issues, whether it is food security, whether it is welcoming the African Union. Because remember, even if it is the war, there is a lot of impact when it comes to energy crisis, when it comes to food security. Yes, Rishi Sunak did mention the war, but he's also talked about how the war has impacted the grain deal, because Russia left the grain deal. So at the press briefing by the MEA today also, what was highlighted was that the impact of conflict, the impact of war, something that they managed to address while working on the Delhi Declaration. So to say that there may not be a Delhi Declaration and we may just have to settle for a chair summary is going to be fairly premature, because India's External Affairs Ministry sounds optimistic about it, and they're saying that they're trying to navigate differences. And even if they manage a declaration, remember, this will be a huge shot in the arm, because the differences were far more stark during Bali. And remember, it is a troika of the global south, that is Bali and India, and next year it will be Brazil, which will be taking over the G20 presidency. So that there you have it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Akanksha and Saddam, for joining us on the broadcast and getting us all the action from the Bharat Mandapam. But let me actually open it to my guests who continue to be with us on the broadcast. Remember, it is an August panel that we have as we celebrate India's presidency, the G20. The summit starts tomorrow. Manjeev Singh Puri, who is a former Indian diplomat, is with us. Tara Karta, who is a distinguished fellow of the IPCS, is with us. Also with us is Raymond Vickery, is an author and advisor on US-India relations. Also with us is Ali Vine, who is a senior analyst. And last but not the least, Ms. Ting Ting Liu, who is a foreign affairs and military correspondent at the TVBS News, is also joining us. Let me actually begin with Ms. Liu. Ms. Liu, the fact that there's so much being said about this joint declaration, I'm taking, off from where our correspondents left us. There is so much of conversation around it. When it is about the media, when it is about the foreign media, as you guys covering it, what is it that you are primarily looking at? Is it the Russia-Ukraine conflict that is going to be dominating this aspect of the G20, or is it going to be the global south, the consensus that India is looking at having, and also the kind of world leadership that's assembled in the national capital of New Delhi, and that says it all?
Thanks for having me on the program. No doubt, we are actually seeing that with G20 coming up right now in India, there's so much happening right there at where you are right now. But I think that it's important to note that in this year's G20 Summit, the fact that the Chinese leader Xi Jinping has not decided to actually make this trip to India has actually put a lot of focus on what is not that's happening on this summit. No doubt we are actually seeing like a lot of like-minded partners trying to come together, trying to come to the summit to work about a couple of consensus where, let's say, at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, what kind of support that the world will want to hope to inject in hopes of actually ending such a humanitarian crisis in that sense. And I think more on the other front, we are actually looking at so-called this new Cold War front, this Cold War front that we are actually seeing happening in Indo-Pacific. But let me just bring your guys' attention back to just slightly a year ago at the G20 Summit in Jakarta, in Indonesia back then. We actually saw that how Biden and Xi Jinping actually met, even though there has actually been not a lot of improvement in US-China relations after that, but it is significant in that sense. But with the fact that the Chinese actually decided to send their Premier Li Chang in place of Xi Jinping, what message did it send to the world? We are actually seeing that how tensions have actually been actively on the rise across the Taiwan Straits, especially in the past year. And then we are seeing the icy coast relations between US and China. And this is happening at this G20 summit. We are not seeing any consensus that could be possibly made at this summit. No doubt we are actually seeing that world leaders are going to meet in India discussing a lot of issues that hopefully where a declaration could be made. But with this key partner's absence, I'm really not sure what kind of this kind of messaging that a few of these leaders, let's say Putin and Xi, will want to send to the world.
Okay, Mr. Puri, let me come to you. I'd first like to take your views on, do you think that this is what is dominating the headlines right now? It is only about the absence of Putin and Xi Jinping from the summit, because there is much more to the summit. India has done so much during the presidency. Taking the world leaders to various other states and even tier 2 cities also becomes really important. It's a reimagining of the presidency by a host country. All of that also needs to be given ample forum. But do you think it's only Xi Jinping and Putin's absence that is being much and majorly talked about, and that's taking the sheen off G20 Summit in India?
Greya, thank you very much. You've asked the question that everybody is asking. So let me try and make a few points clear. A, both China and Russia are participating in the summit. China has the Prime Minister there, the Russian Foreign Minister is there, and let me assure you that their interests and what they want to say will be reflected in the deliberations here. Now, having said this, of course, I acknowledge the fact that President Putin is not here and that President Xi Jinping is not here. There are signaling issues. We all must accept this particular fact for what it is worth. And there is a certain sense of why you and your compatriots across the media world are sort of raising this particular question. Having said all this, let me draw your attention to a few things. One, the point that you made, and you made it very well, a kind of democratization of the G20, taking it to 60 odd cities in India, 200 meetings, not just hosting the meetings in different parts of India, but getting people from across the world, not just the G20 countries, international organizations, experts, to come to India, making the people of India, in a sense, involved. If I may use another cliched term, making global and local come together. In India, there's a huge amount of pride, and I am sure all the visitors are feeling the fact that India is a country that has not just put its best foot forward, but is making every effort to be the bridge to ensure that the G20 summit and its outcome is one which caters to the betterment of humanity, becomes a human-centric approach. Let's remember, we had Indonesia, after India it will be Brazil and then South Africa.
Correct.
We have made a determined effort that the voice of the global South becomes important. And I believe that on this particular thing, all countries are on the same page. Let's forget the politics of, what the document looks like, etc. Look, the G20 is not a treaties body. It's not a law-making body. It's a place where countries come and become of the same mind, Some issues go to the legal bodies where you take legal decisions, the IMF or the United Nations, the World Trade Organizations. Some issues are about national actions in consonance. So I think that our efforts have paid off, are paying off, and I would like to really echo what the Sherpa said. This will be an outcome which will be the voice of the global south, and I think that will benefit not just the global south but the entire humanity, and that's been the big effort of India.
Right. And Tara, taking the cue from what has just been said, I'd really like to understand, talking about India as a friend of the global south, positioning itself as the Vishwamitra. I also want to understand this whole aspect of including the African Union into the G20. Will it be G21 by the end of the summit is also the next big question that everybody is asking. What are your views on this? Tara.
Oh, yes. Actually, from what, this whole thing about the common, a common outcome and so on, yes, it's important to get a common outcome. But I would really echo what, the ambassador said. There is nothing in this is legally binding. I mean, a chairman's summary is no doubt is better to have a communique. In the end, it has to go to an international organization. It has to go to a bank. It has to go elsewhere to get implemented. Right? That is what. And the main thing is that when we say, I mean, a lot of people outside are downing this issue that we are becoming the voice of the global south, but this is very important to us because the global south's issues are exactly what the issues that we face in terms of finance, in terms of climate, in terms of development agendas. So when we say that we are going to speak for them, it's a very powerful resonance across, the world. And please remember, this is being followed up with action. It's not just that we are just talking about it. Our loans to the global south has gone up hugely from the last year. I think it's gone up to about 33 billion. I'm not sure about the figure. That was last year's figure. I think it's gone up more. Recently, we've given a loan to Nigeria, a huge loan. There's a credit line to Ethiopia. So we are following this up with whatever we can do from our side. What the crucial thing, please remember, this whole G20 began as a finance minister's outfit. That is why the finance document is the most important. Yeah. And I just looked at that finance summary, the chairman's summary. It's not terribly encouraging. So the fact that there is not one word on debt relief. They're talking of debt restructuring, they're talking of there's a lot of verbiage, but the fact is, like, Africa, I think, has a total of 1.3 trillion debt. That's what the African Development Bank says. Who's going to deal with that? So these are the issues you are going to have to deal with, regardless of whether the African Union comes or not, because the world's investments are there in Africa. If these countries go down the drain, your own economy is going to get hit. It's a causal relationship. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not just it's not generosity. It is self-interest.
No, and even when we talk about the financial inclusion push, I really want to understand this aspect also from you, Tara. The fact that we're also talking at the time where the rupee has hit an all-time low, we're talking about financial inclusion, we are talking about DPI, the digital public infrastructure, everything is out there, and it has really been lauded even by the International Monetary Fund. How do we juxtapose these two things?
You have to, like you said, there's a perfect storm, right? That's what everyone is talking about. There's the climate crisis, there's the pandemic, which we expect more, there's the financial crisis. All of this is coming together.
Okay. Can I interrupt you for just a second? We are playing out visuals of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Bangladesh Prime Minister, Ms. Shaikh Hasina. There's this visual of the bilateral meeting that is currently happening at the Prime Minister's residence in the national capital. Remember, this is also one of the important and key bilateral meets between the two leaders. Only yesterday, Shaikh Hasina had made a very important statement about the minorities, the Hindu minorities in Bangladesh, and how they should feel very much included in the country, and that was a crucial statement that she'd made right ahead of her visit to the national capital for the G20 Summit. She's currently at the Prime Minister's residence in Delhi, and the bilateral is going on. We will try and get in a word on what exactly is going to be the agenda of this particular bilateral. Remember, this is the second bilateral that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is hosting after his Mauritius counterpart met with him. It is now Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh, and then it is going to be the big ticket bilateral with US President Joe Biden later this evening. So these are the live visuals that are coming to you from the Prime Minister's residence. Yes, Taras, I'm really sorry to interrupt you there. We had to just cut across to those visuals. Please continue the point that you were making.
The point I think what you had asked is how we deal with this whole crisis as we go along. See, climate crisis has led to a huge inflation, food inflation in this country. Last year, you had a wheat crisis because of climate change. Now, we had positioned ourselves to become the wheat supply of the world following Ukraine, right? That was how you couldn't do it because of we did eventually, of course, we did export a record amount of wheat. But what I'm saying is, even if you make the right foreign policy, domestic decisions, all of those are likely to be overturned by climate. And this time, if you look at the climate summary in the G20, look at what the UN climate chief is saying. He says it's dismal. There is no agreement on very, very specific issues on how to deal with climate change and how to get to that 2% reduction which we're talking of. Precisely because each economy is in trouble. So it's a kind of a vicious circle. The more a country is in trouble, the less likely it is to go in for climate change, climate mitigation efforts.
All right.
And critical thing, climate, the technology which you need for alternative energy, that is the third disagreement point, by the way. That technology is worth about 10 trillion. No one is going to give it to you for free.
Absolutely, and that's a very important point, Mr. Vine, that Tara is making. Would you like to throw in your 2 bits about this? Because whether it is green energy, whether it is the climate change, becomes a crucial aspect of G20 Summit. The world leaders really need to get together and do something about it. And that is what the key agenda also remains of this summit. However, we are right now talking about the conflicting issues that govern the Western world, and that has been sort of the dominant aspect of this summit. Don't you think somewhere the climate change, the crisis needs to actually take that priority and be much talked about?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest concerns that I have is the extent to which some of these geopolitical frictions actually undermine the ability of the G20 to make progress on managing transnational challenges such as climate change. One point of optimism, obviously, we don't know what the final deliverables will be, but one point of cautious optimism is I think that India will achieve some progress in reforming multilateral development banks to reroute more climate capital, more green capital, as it were, to developing countries. I think that if India could make progress on that agenda item, I think that it would be a big success for the G20. But there's no question, if you compare the G20 today to the G20, say, a decade ago, geopolitical frictions are much more pronounced now, and they do impede the ability of the G20 to make progress on these very important issues.
All right. Now, I want to bring in, Mr. Vikri also. But, Mr. Vikri, I would have to just go into this very small press conference that is being right now spearheaded by the U.S. Secretary General. He's currently speaking. I'll come back to you because we have to talk about the all-important bilateral between President Joe Biden and the Indian Prime Minister. We will come back to you in just a bit.
The benefits. They include an SDG stimulus of at least $500 billion per year, an effective debt workout mechanism to support payment suspensions, longer lending terms, and lower rates on fairer terms to developing countries in distress, a meaningful capitalization and change in the business model of multilateral development banks to be able to massively leverage private finance at reasonable cost to developing countries, a more substantive rechanneling of unused special drawing rights to increase liquidity where it is needed most, and a shift in subsidies away from fossil fuel to more sustainable and productive uses. Together, these actions would catalyze SDG progress and help developing economies invest in key transitions across energy, food systems, digital, education, health, decent jobs, and social protection. All of these within reach. but it will take all hands. No nation, no region, no group, not even the G20 can do it alone. We must act together as one family to save our one hearth and safeguard our one future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First question will go to, before I go.
That was the UN Secretary General. Mr. Raymond Vickery, coming to you now. I'm really sorry to keep you waiting, sir. I'd like to understand from you. Now we are waiting for that bilateral between US President Joe Biden and the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi. This is going to be a key meeting between the two world leaders ahead of the G20 Summit. First of all, what do you think will be up on the agenda and what is going to be the outcome? If we are going to bank on conjecture, what do you think is happening here?
Well, thanks very much for having me. Yes, I think it's very important to note that President Biden, unlike President Xi, has shown up. In fact, President Biden showed up a day early. He's having dinner at the Prime Minister's residence, which is very significant as opposed to some office meeting. This is a continuation, really, of what has been going on between the United States and India for some time, and particularly the June summit meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. What will be on the agenda is going to be primarily how to have these two great democracies work together in leading the world in terms of economic development, in terms of what World Bank lending, in terms of adjusting debts. It is plain that that India and the United States have the same interest in this regard. You see that India, under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, has adopted the theme of one Earth, one family, one future. And that is exactly the way in which the United States wants to approach this. So I think the very significant increases in terms of the international approach to providing infrastructure, to providing the digital infrastructure as well as physical, and that the United States and India, as the two great democracies of the world, are on the same page in this regard.
Okay. And what do you have to say about how much of a US influence is going to be crucial and critical? And going back to this question that I started this discussion with, in the official declaration, the Delhi Declaration, because we do know how US has weighed in time and again on the China issue with India and globally as well. How much of an aspect, a crucial aspect, will that be playing?
I think it'll be very crucial. And as I say, the United States is in New Delhi in the person of our president to support India, to make India's leadership of the G20 this year a complete success. And so I think that the United States is going to be working hand in glove with India to see that there is a consensus in the G20. The wild card here, of course, is just how obdurate and obstructionist China and Russia are going to be to prevent this. It seems to me very clear that China wants to have the Indian leadership of the G20 viewed as a failure. That's the reason Xi is staying away. This is the first time that the president of China has not participated in the G20. So it's perfectly obvious what is going on. But I think that this is going to backfire on China. And when you have these two great democracies able to work across the board, north and south, east and west, it's very likely that we're going to get a statement which will be very strong. There will be dissent, of course, from China and Russia, but I think everybody else will be basically going in the same direction of trying to build peace and prosperity in the world.
Okay. All right. Mr. Puri, coming back to you, let's now also talk about some of the bad press that G20 is getting, even back home. Whether it is about the amount of money that's been spent on the endorsements vis-a-vis G20 or the makeover, what the national capital has received, that has been much talked about against Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership, or even the kind of hoardings that we've seen in the national capital dotting all the streets. It has been termed as an election campaign and an endorsement for Prime Minister Narendra Modi ahead of 2024 general elections, and also an endorsement of him as one of the tallest global leaders. How does one deal with these kind of distractions?
Griya, look, let's say one thing. After 40 years, India is hosting such a major, large-scale get-together of global leaders.
Yeah.
You know, I joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1982, and in 1983, we hosted the summit of the non-aligned movement. Today, 40 years later, obviously, I'm incredibly proud that we are hosting the world's largest economies, the most powerful countries, and so many others from the global south. Now, you know, this is India's moment of pride. This is India's moment of the world noting that India has emerged, not just emerging, but is an economy and the country that is going places. Let me draw your attention to one simple fact. We've become the largest country in the world. Many in our country say, what does that matter? Please think for a few seconds. The problems are the same, the problems will remain. But as far as the world is concerned, the perceptions will change slowly but surely, because you are the largest country. In any reform, anywhere, without you, things will not move forward. Believe me, it's not a bad idea to stand first in any line, especially an important line. And this is something that we need to understand. Look, we are a country which is a democracy, a free press. You yourself are leading all of this. You have a right to make comments. People have a right to ask questions about money spent, etc. But my understanding is that so much of what has been happening because of the year-long activities which were facilitated and pushed by the government, but after that actually taken up by the people. I'll give you a little example. The G20 chief coordinator was asked about the G20 logo.
Yes.
And he said that initially there were thoughts about patenting it and so on. Then somebody spoke about licensing, and finally he said nobody is asking us. It's being used everywhere. That's the nature of India's involvement with the G20. We are proud and we are extremely delighted that it's happening, and that's why you see all of this that is happening. We are welcoming, but we are also very happy that we have reached a point where the globe is recognizing us. We are a country of interest, a country of being reckoned with.
Okay. Mr. Vine, I'd want to understand this one aspect from you. You know, this meeting of the Russian representation that we have at the summit in Mr. Lavrov and the External Affairs Minister, Mr. S. Jaishankar, on the sidelines of the G20 summit. They met in Jakarta. How does one read that meeting, especially after there was no consensus as far as the Delhi Declaration is concerned, on a compromise text, quote unquote, that the West did not agree to as far as India was concerned when it is about the joint declaration? How crucial is that meeting with India and Russia, and how do you read that?
So there's no question that India, in terms of its strategic alignment, it's aligning more and more with the West, whether that's bilaterally with the United States, whether it's through the auspices of the Quad, which brings together a number of other advanced industrial democracies. But India, as a result of its history during the Cold War, it does have a legacy relationship with Russia. And the relationships that it has, whether it's in terms of energy, whether it's in terms of arms, India is diversifying away from Russia, but those are not ties that can be dissolved overnight. I think that if anything, the fact that President Putin is not attending actually eliminates a potential headache for the Indian hosts. I think that if President Putin had been present, I think that there would be even more focus on disagreements among the members over how to talk about Russian aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine. So, in many ways, President Putin's absence, I think it eliminates a headache for the Indian hosts, and I think that there will be, of course, conversations between Indian officials and Russian officials, but I think that India will try to ensure that those don't dominate.
Okay, but Tara,
what
can you
India wants to
really
be a
say
success.
that India is aligned more with the West? Can we really say that, considering we are talking, at a time when India is hosting the G20 Summit as a friend of the various countries globally, a Vishwamitra to the world is how we are presenting India as. Just aligning with the Western ideology, especially in the wake of the Russia the Ukrainian conflict, or even with the China issue, do you think this can be a statement that can be made at the moment? Because that is the crucial aspect where things are at a status quo from where we see. Tara.
Yeah, no, I think your question is very pertinent because it's not a question of aligning with anybody. We align with our interests. It's as simple as that. So, which is what we did in terms of what our energy needs. We did because we can't afford high energy prices. So we did what we had to do. Also, please remember, in terms of our nuclear reactors, for instance, the next Russian nuclear reactor, the fourth one in Kudankulam was shipped in 2 months back. And the fifth one is due. So that is a very, very continuing and important relationship. Whether we will now next move into the reactor phase with the US, which is long delayed, as you know, and which is probably, in my senses, that's going to go ahead soon. So these are different bets that we are placing wherever you get a good deal. So while it is true, I mean, certainly in terms of, because of Chinese aggression, we've started to move closer to the West because you need some kind of a backup, in terms of defense, in terms of intelligence. In fact, China is literally pushing us into the Western arms, which is why I find Beijing's whole policy towards India extremely puzzling. I mean, so that in that sense, we have still maintained, despite all the provocations, we've maintained a certain, certainly not business as usual, but we've maintained a certain relationship with Beijing. We had the BRICS meeting recently, which went off very well, by the way. You have the BRICS Bank, which is an excellent example in terms of green, backing green initiatives. All that is going on. But at the same time, the fact that President Xi chose not to come, as yet we don't know why, but there are rumors and counter rumors floating. But that sends an extremely bad signal for us and for the G20 as a whole.
Okay. Mr. Raymond Vickery, going back to this point that you were making about the significance of the relationship between India and US, that becomes really key. But when we talk about G20 and we talk about the group of 7, that also is, there's a lot of history to it. There was a reason why G20 was formed, and hence there is more domination of all these emerging economies, and that's why US is also part of this grouping. How do you see that balance really being made, especially in the wake of Mr. Joe Biden being in the country for the G20 Summit, and the kind of conversations that will emerge, not just out of the bilateral, but also from the summit altogether?
Well, the way I see it, India, in adopting the slogan of one Earth, one family, one future, has exactly put it as it should be going forward. That is, this old division between East and West, North and South, that has broken down in the face of modern technology, in the realities of international relations. And what is going on here is an alignment not in accordance with history and what happened with the Soviet Union, but what values do these two great democracies, India and the US, have and share? And when you look at these values, and I would submit that values are as much an interest of the nation as is oil, is arms, is territorial. It's the values which bind the United States and India, and which are on a march throughout the developing world as well. There have been setbacks, but there is no question in my mind that India and the United States, whether it comes to World Bank financing, whether it comes to infrastructure development, whether it has to do with financial regulation, are more aligned than the authoritarian approaches of China and Russia.
Okay.
And that is the way in which this will go forward, I believe.
All right. All right. All right. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Vikri. And that was an important perspective that you have, in fact, got for us. We're constantly playing out live visuals of all the world leaders who keep arriving in the national capital. We also are now waiting the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, to arrive in the national capital. I believe these are the visuals that are going to be played out in just a second from that spot where the dignitaries are currently arriving. We would be playing out those live visuals for you, and this also becomes a very significant visit of a world leader. US President Joe Biden is already slated to arrive. We've already told you about the Bangladesh Prime Minister, Ms. Shaikh Hasina, who's already having a bilateral with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Also, he's had a conversation with his Mauritian counterpart, and now it is the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Anthony Albanese, is going to be arriving. There you have Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, all set to welcome Mr. Albanese as he arrives in the national capital. Remember, all the union ministers have been designated, given this task of, in fact, going and welcoming all the world leaders. And this time it is Rajiv Chandrasekhar who is going to be, in fact, welcoming the Australian Prime Minister as he arrives in the national capital ahead of the G20 Summit. My colleague Abhishek Jha is with us on the broadcast. Abhishek, we were talking about how crucial all these visits of the world leaders are. G20 Summit, India as the president. Anthony Albanese's visit becomes really crucial, like we've always been talking about the US president. And we also know when Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Australia, the rousing welcome that he'd received over there. And all of that is going to be part of that discourse once Anthony Albanese arrives and lands. In fact, he is about to, because the plane is there. It has touched down into the country. There he is.
Of course, and there has been multiple issues that the two sides have been able to, move forward upon. Issue of mobility, issue of, trade agreement. These are the certain, takeaways from the recent bilateral relationship of India and Australia that has seen, more strength. Recently, Prime Minister was in Australia where during this Quad Summit level talks. But that bilateral visit of Prime Minister was very, the kind of ceremonial welcome that he got and the warm reception by the Indians diaspora living in Australia that he got, that clearly defines what India-Australia relationship is all about. India-Australia relationship is also important because of the Indo-Pacific region where the two sides have been collaborating and cooperating, and they are part of this Quad grouping also, which tries to, in a way, counterbalance the dominance of a particular country and keep the region rules-based and free for all, transparent, and not in a way dominated by a particular
Abhishek, I'm
country.
really sorry to interrupt you. Let's explain the visuals that we see on the screens. There you have Anthony Albanese along with his wife, who has arrived in the national capital. He's been welcomed by Union Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar. Abhishek, this also becomes very significant because when it is about the Indian-Australian ties, they have unfortunately also seen a lot of tussle because of the kind of Khalistan protests that the country has seen, the referendums that the country has seen, and all of that was part of the dialogue between India and Australia back then also when it was the Quad Summit. And I believe even in this bilateral ahead of G20, it is going to be forming some part of the conversation.
Indian community, their security is of paramount interest to Indian government, and whenever there has been an attack on Indian communities or people of Indian origin in some countries, India has always tried to raise the issue diplomatically. In the recent months, we have seen increased attempt by the pro-Khalistan grouping or anti-India groupings to increase the sentiment against India in countries like UK, USA, Canada, Australia, in some parts of Europe as well. Fortunately, Australia has been one of the countries which has opposed such incidences vehemently. There have been official communication and official statements from Delhi also, the High Commissioner of Australia, and then we had issued a statement. Then we saw a statement by Penny Wong, the Australian Foreign Minister, also on the issue. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese also issued a statement saying that bilateral cooperation or the bilateral ties are more necessary. They are strong enough, but certain violent extremists or certain people who are in the pretense of freedom of expression trying to disturb the peace and harmony in the Australian society, that will not be tolerated. And these goons who are trying to do every single act under the pretext of freedom of expression and speech and democratic right to protest, they'll be dealt with. So we have seen certain decrease also in such incidences in Australia. So, and that tells the kind of importance the two sides have given to the bilateral relationship, and the small irritants like these fringe elements who try to create an issue out of nothing in terms of creating an anti-India sentiment in Australia, they have been dealt with in a way that the bilateral relationship at least doesn't seem to be impacted by those small irritants.
Right, and also Abhishek, there is much talked about a poolside meeting with Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister Narendra Modi this Saturday when the summit starts tomorrow. And also the crucial aspect, ahead of the summit, he has really underlined this aspect and this key point that he is deeply invested in the Indo-Pacific. How does one read those statements?
So Indo-Pacific remains a very crucial region where about 40% of the world trade happens, and for this reason to remain very open, transparent and free for all is very necessary.
Okay.
Not only Australia and India, but also countries like Philippines, Myanmar, Vietnam, Brunei. These are all part of Indo-Pacific, and the maritime boundaries of these countries goes along these boundaries of South China Sea as well, where we have seen in the recent past multiple occasion where Chinese side have tried to show their aggression and the posturing that they dominate the area. Recent map incident that has also happened where China has included certain maritime territory of these countries into its own map has also created some controversy where the countries have opposed Chinese action and asked China to withdraw that map. So the dominance that China has tried to create both politically, economically, and also in terms of boundary-wise, like pushing away the boundary and trying to infringe upon the other boundaries of other countries. These are the concerns that the smaller countries in the region wants to counter. Australia is also, in a way, being challenged by the Chinese dominance in that area, but Australia has also tried to keep its security and the regional cooperation very strong, and India happens to be one of the pillars in Indo-Pacific where Australia and India are cooperating to counter any such dominance.
All right, Abhishek, I would request you to stay on with us because we are now getting news that Air Force One has touched down in the national capital. So any minute now, US President Joe Biden will be seen arriving in the national capital for the all-important G20 Summit and also the bilateral ahead of that with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We have word that he is going to go straight to the Prime Minister's residence for the bilateral between India and United States of America. Key discussions are going to be made, and that is the big ticket bilateral that all eyes are currently on right ahead of the G20 Summit that starts tomorrow. And we will be bringing you those visuals. We are standing by for those visuals at the moment. But at the moment, we're slipping into a very short break. We're coming right back on Viewpoint. Welcome back. We are cutting across live to Air Force One that has touched down in the national capital. US President Joe Biden all set to get down from the aircraft. Remember, he is arriving here for the G20 Summit and for the all-important bilateral with the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi. The bilateral talk is something that all eyes are currently upon. Remember, just a short while before his, in fact, starting for his trip to India, there was a COVID scare at the White House. His wife had tested positive, and it only just a short while before he was all set to make that journey was it announced by the White House that he, in fact, is negative. So in all probability, you will see a masked US President Joe Biden getting down from that aircraft any minute now, and then heading straight to the Prime Minister's residence in the national capital for that all-important bilateral. If you take a look at the agenda that is possibly going to be discussed as far as that meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi is concerned, we do see that there is going to be some sort of a progress on a number of issues, especially the jet engine deal, the procurement of Predator drones, also on 5G and 6G spectrum and collaboration on critical and emerging technologies, and also the progress in the civil nuclear areas. This was, remember, also mentioned by the National Security